Welcome to my presentation. I want to talk a little bit about the economic impact of open source, particularly on small businesses. I know this is probably a little bit less technical than some of the other talks here at WordCamp, but I think it's important to talk about because so many people using WordPress are small businesses, and we want to say, what is that impact? What impact does open source software like WordPress have on the small business economy? So that's what I want to dive into today. A little bit about myself. My name is Jared Smith. I'm the Director of Open Source Outreach at a little company called Bluehost. Maybe you've heard of it. But I've been in open source communities for a long time. Open source communities here in Utah. Back when I lived in Utah, I was part of the Utah PHP users group, and the Salt Lake Linux users group, and the Provo Linux users group, and some of the other Linux users groups around. Before coming to Bluehost, I was the Fedora project leader, so if anybody uses Fedora Linux, woohoo. If not, there's still time to change. But I've spent a lot of time in open source communities, helping communities to grow and thrive and develop and find the resources they need. My role at Bluehost is a little bit different. It's giving back to open source communities. It's helping them find the resources that they need to grow and thrive and develop. And I'll talk a little bit more about that near the end of my presentation. The way that this presentation came about was that Bluehost is part of a larger group of companies. That's part of the Endurance International Group. And the Endurance International Group owns Bluehost, HostGator, FatCow, iPower, JustHost, Domain.com, a bunch of different hosting and domain companies you've probably heard of. And our CEO, a guy by the name of Hari Ravichandran, was speaking with Tim O'Reilly from O'Reilly Media, and talking about that, Endurance International and Bluehost, we love open source. We're mostly built on open source. We want to give back to open source communities. What are some new and interesting and creative ways that we could give back to open source communities? And Tim O'Reilly started talking about it and said, it'd be really interesting to try to figure out, what is the impact of open source on the economy? Does that sound like it'd be something easy to measure? No, I don't think so. So just so you know, I like lots of feedback as I'm presenting here. I'm not just going to stand up and do death by PowerPoint here. So I'm going to be looking for feedback. Nod your head like this if things are making sense. If I'm going too fast, nod your head like this so I can tell if people are paying attention. Okay. So how do we measure the real economics of open source? Is that easy to do? We know that, from surveys and whatnot, that about 85% of all websites are powered by an open source web server, whether that's Apache or Nginx or the Google web server or something like that. But how do we measure the real economic impact? Carmen, you're smart. How would you measure the economic impact of open source?
Open source? One way you can think of is looking at all the money that a company may have saved, and where they can use, how they can use that money for something else, employees or.
Perfect. So that's exactly what we did. We said, how can we measure this? How can we figure out how much money people are saving? That's still not an easy thing to do. Obviously, there's big players in the open source space, companies like Red Hat and MySQL before they got gobbled up by Oracle, that you could say they're kind of a pure play open source company. We can measure their revenues. That's one way of kind of a proxy, to approximate, what's the value of open source out there. But much of the value that open source creates is tied up in what we call hidden economies. And hidden economies. Now I apologize, the font's a little garbled there, but we took this graphic right out of the print version of the paper here, and it's a little garbled. But the idea of hidden economies, there's hidden economies all around us. If you were to go out and take your car to a mechanic and get the brakes fixed, that's something that economists could measure, and they could say, the mechanics are making 13% more profits this year than last year, right? But if you replace the brakes on your car yourself, nobody's measuring that. It's a hidden economy. Same thing for do-it-yourself repairs at home or gardening, things like that. There's these hidden economies all around us. And open source is one of those mostly hidden economies.
Are you factoring what we call knowledge economy as well?
we didn't necessarily dive into that because that makes it even harder to measure. I mean, we know that it's there, but knowledge economies are even harder to put a firm number on. But yeah, that's another example of economies that aren't readily measurable. Economists have a hard time tracking them and keeping track of them. I think the best example of kind of hidden economies was another thing that Tim O'Reilly talked about. In 1975, there was an environmentalist by the name of Steve Baer, and he wrote a book called Sunspots. Now, I realize 1975 was a long time ago. I was born in 1975, so that's before I was on the internet, at least. But he wrote a book called Sunspots, and he describes what he calls the clothesline paradox. He says, if you take down your clothesline and you buy an electric dryer, what happens? The energy that was consumed in your neighborhood, your house, in your neighborhood, in your state, and the country goes up by a little bit, right? The economic measures can take into account. Manufacturing was up 3% because somebody had to manufacture the dryer. Sales were up at the department store by 2% because somebody had to sell the dryer and that sort of thing. But if you go in the opposite direction, what if you stop using your clothes dryer and you go hang your clothes on a clothesline? Are the economists measuring solar energy that actually went into drying your clothes? Not at all. And so, that was kind of the premise of working with O'Reilly and writing a research paper that we did with O'Reilly and came out with this past summer. It's called The Economic Impact of Open Source on Small Business, a case study. And so what I want to do in my talk today is talk about some of the things that came out of this research study that we did with O'Reilly. First of all, why small business? Small business important at all? How? Why?
It employs a large percentage of the population.
Yeah. Over half the U.S. population that's employed is employed by small businesses. How about economic output? How much of the GDP comes from small business? Majority. The majority of the U.S. gross domestic product comes from small businesses. So the thing we tried to set out with, when we wrote this study was we said we're going to make this assumption that open source is the engine that drives small business, and small business is the engine that drives the U.S. economy. If that's true, then we need to measure what impact does that open source software have on the U.S. economy as a whole, and particularly on the small business economy. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what we set out to prove. Question over here.
Just for clarification, what is small business?
So different organizations have different measurements of what constitutes a small business or a medium-sized business. What we did for our research study was we took businesses between one employee and 50 employees to be small to medium-sized businesses. Different groups will measure that differently. I think if you go look at the Small Business Administration website, SBA.gov, I think they measure a small business as up to 250 employees or 500 employees. I can't remember. It's not necessarily revenue-based. We did dive into revenue on the businesses, and then we can get more into it in the study. But it was really based on number of employees in the company, not necessarily on revenue. We'll dive into a little bit of the economics here. Yeah, that was part of the problem, is defining what's a small to medium-sized business, because it has little different measurements of how that works. So I know you guys want to get into detail, so let's dive right in and look at kind of how we did the research study, how we got the data. So Endurance International and its Bluehost subsidiary, we host about 7 million domains for about 2 million customer accounts. Most of those are small and medium-sized businesses. And since we published a paper this past July, Endurance International also acquired HostGator. So that added, another 5 million domains, and another probably 650,000 accounts, something like that. So the HostGator data doesn't play into the research paper as we did it this summer, but we're going to update the data for next year, and we'll have a bigger set of data. So what we did is we took some anonymous usage data from our accounts. We also send out a survey to everybody that has an account with us, asking them to please take this survey. and we got something like 4,000 responses back on the survey. So we took between the anonymous usage data, the survey data that we got back, we know that we've got a statistically significant sample size that we can actually start diving into the data, looking at what happened. So let's take just a minute and talk about some of the surprising results that came out of the data, first of all. We asked customers, what's your level of sophistication with web development, with getting your website up and running on the internet? 31% of the respondents said that they were beginners. 40% said they were intermediate. 15% said they were advanced. And another 14% said that they were professionals, making a living doing web development or that sort of thing. That being said, I thought it was very interesting that 75% of the respondents said that they got their website up and running on the internet by themselves. The other 25% had someone else do that for them. Of that 25%, half had a friend or a coworker do it, and the other half, or 12% of the total, had some third party, paid some third party to build their website and get it up on the internet for them. So why do you think companies put a website up on the internet? Exposure? And if you're a small business, does it make sense to get on the internet? Do you need to be on the internet? Do you need a website? So there was a McKinsey study that came out last year that said small and medium-sized businesses who have a strong internet presence are twice as profitable as those who don't. Might make a difference, right? Easy way to make twice as much profit? Well, invest in the internet.
So one of my main clients sells merchant accounts, and it's kind of like a franchise, like a State Farm Insurance. So there's competing offices. So he just has a small office, and I do all of his internet marketing. And company-wide, his next competitor, they're usually bouncing between 7 and 8, 9, right around there for the top 10 offices across the country. And his competitor drops about $50,000 to $60,000 a month in postcard mailings and does not have a web presence. And he spent all of his web presence is completely organic. Meaning if he doesn't spend a dime next month, his business is going to come in, and they compete 7, 8, 9 right there for the same business, and he has no outlay. His competitor is laying out $60,000
in postcard mailings. So yeah, that makes a huge difference. One of the nice things about starting a small business in this day and age is if you've got an internet presence, you've got the potential to reach clients clear around the world. You're not worried about are people driving past my storefront? Am I getting my business name out there, my marketing out there to the people in my neighborhood? The whole world is your neighborhood when you have an internet presence. So that's interesting. One other. So we talked about. We asked the respondents, why do you have a website? What is your main reason for having a website? 48% of the respondents said that they have a business that they have a website for, but they don't have an online store. Another 22% said that their site was for personal reasons. They just wanted a personal website. Another 12% said that they run their business off their website, but they do have an online store, so it's aimed particularly at e-commerce. And then another 9% was nonprofit. Nonprofits are just informational websites about an organization. We asked the account holders, do you make money off your website, or is it just there for informational reasons? 36% of the respondents said the majority of their revenue comes because they have a website. Another 33% said part of their income, but not necessarily majority, comes because they have a web presence. So again, there's an economic impact there for just in having a web presence. We talked a little bit more about the folks that are doing e-commerce and collecting payments online. 53% are collecting simply through PayPal. So that was the winner there. Only 26% are taking credit cards online. 12% are only doing electronic check or money orders. And then the last 9% of that was credit cards taken over the phone, but not over the internet. I thought that was interesting. So obviously PayPal's the the big winner there. Lots of reasons why that's probably the case, but probably ease of use and ease of getting up and running. Well, something like getting WordPress connected up to say PayPal to accept payments is pretty easy compared to going out and getting a credit card merchant account, getting that set up, and dealing with the banks and all that kind of stuff. So that was the winner there. We talked with the respondents about revenue. What kind of revenue do you derive from your website? The majority of the businesses are very small. Only 15% of the respondents had a revenue of $50,000 or more per year. But if you add up all those small businesses together collectively, they represent about $1 trillion of economic output. So that's a big number. When you start talking about trillions, you get the attention of economists, right? And then last but not least, because I'm an open source geek, I had to ask the respondents, have you heard the term open source, or are you familiar with open source? Do you know what open source is? And I was surprised. 2/3 of the respondents said yes, they were familiar with what open source is and how it works. So that's kind of fun. So another piece of information. Economic impact. What would happen if your website went down? If your website was down for an extended period of time, would that have an impact on your business? 51% said it would have a detrimental impact on their website, on their business. 19% said it would significantly impact their business, and 9% said they would be completely out of business if their website went down. So is it important? Absolutely. One of the other things that we found is that the majority of small businesses use some sort of content management system. And of those people using content management systems, obviously the majority are using WordPress. So first I want to give you some stats from the WordPress.org website, just to give you an idea of the impact that WordPress makes out there. And then I want to talk about some of the Bluehost data and the international data that we looked at on our own systems. So to give you an idea of the impact of WordPress, there are 75 million websites out there using WordPress. 350 million people viewing 2.5 billion pages each month. Or 500,000 new posts and 400,000 comments on WordPress sites every single day. Think about that for a minute. When we looked at our own data, at Bluehost we have a one-click installer called SimpleScripts that the majority of our customers use to install things like WordPress. We had, of the 1.8 million SimpleScripts clients, we had 2.3 million WordPress installations. So that means that the average website that we host, the average account that in our system has more than one WordPress installation on it, which was very interesting. Of all the software that gets installed through our SimpleScripts installer, 65% of that is WordPress. One application, 65% of all the installs. The next closest was a competing content management system, Joomla, with 9%. So it shows you just the disparity between WordPress and the rest of content management systems. So I dove a little bit deeper into our data. There were 3,847 installations of WordPress on our system, and just on our accounts in the last 24 hours, and another 8,976 upgrades to 3.4 over the past 24 hours. Or if you want to look at the last month, 118,000 installations of WordPress and 303,000 upgrades, and I think I've got the yearly numbers here too. 1.2 million installs over the past year and 1.8 million upgrades. So,
I mean, do you know what that is trending for? Is WordPress going to be more used?
Absolutely, it's to the point where about 1 in 6 new websites on the internet are WordPress powered. 16%. Now, if that's not encouraging news for the people in this room, I don't know what is. Right? Pretty cool. So there's obviously an impact there. There's obviously a lot of people using it. How do we measure that? So let's dive in and look at, I want to talk about just a couple of case studies that we did in the paper just to look at small businesses and how they're really using open source software. In this case, both of these companies happen to be using WordPress, so I thought it would be great to bring them up in this presentation here. The first is a company called CocoKnits. It was started by a gal by the name of Julie Weisenberger. She simply started doing knitting patterns and putting those knitting patterns online, and found that people were willing to pay for those. And so she started a little website to put knitting patterns online and try to make some money off of it. So she spends about $1,000 a month on her website. Of that, about $25 a month for e-commerce, $75 a month for email marketing, and then her hosting and some custom programming that she has a third party do for is about another $908 a month. So it adds up to just over $1,000 a month in what she's spending. When we talked to her, interviewed her, said, well, what technologies are you using? You know, how are you making your website work? She got a little, scratched her head a little bit and said, well, I don't really know. I just have this guy I know, and he takes care of it for me. And I know that it works, but I don't know exactly how it works. So she put us in contact with him. Talking to him, it's powered by WordPress, but he uses some third-party plugins. He uses a proprietary e-commerce system, a proprietary email marketing system. And so the other thing that we asked Julie about was, you know, are you doing anything as far as search engine optimization or marketing for keyword searches and those sorts of things? And she says, well, I've heard of that kind of stuff, but I'm not really interested in that right now. You know, maybe I'll come around to doing some of that sort of stuff. So to kind of sum up this case study, she was spending about $1,000 a month, getting about $4,000 to $5,000 a month in revenue. And she was comfortable with that. For something that she was doing part-time and having fun with on the internet, that worked well. The second case study we did was with a small company called Castle Chat that just started in March of this year. Started by Brian and Nicole Sidwar. Anybody tell what that is? It's the castle in Disney World, right? They love to go to Disney World, and they said, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could just live in Orlando and go to Disney World all the time and somehow start a small business helping other people come and have fun at Disney World, and they could go with it? So they did. So they wanted to build a website just about all around helping other people take advantage of their experience at Disney World. So offer news, reviews, information, where to park, where to eat, where to stay in the Orlando area. This case study was a little different in that Brian, the co-owner of the company, he just learned how to do this all on his own. He didn't have a programming background. He'd never done anything as far as programming, but he started saying, "Oh, I can figure out how to get WordPress up and running on a host." That wasn't too hard. And, "Oh, I need to make this change. I guess I can learn a little JavaScript." So he reads articles online and he buys books and he figures out how to do it on his own. And so he's got the site again running on WordPress. The hosting's done on Linux. The database is MySQL. He takes payments using PayPal. His hosting costs are less than $5 a month. And then he puts a little bit of money into PayPal account fees and those sorts of things. So his total cost is around $44 a month. So a little bit different than that first case study, right? Julie was spending $1,000 a month. Brian and Nicole spending $44 a month. And I can't remember the exact amount of revenue that they were bringing in. I think we've got it here in the paper. Give me 2 seconds. So they were spending $44 a month, and they were bringing in, got it right here, about $34,000. Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. That was the Cocoa Nits. Anyway, I'll find it later. I don't want to hold things up, but. Anyway, they said they're trending about 7,100 unique visitors a month, and they should pass 10,000 unique visitors a month here this month. So they're doing quite well with that.
Can you just give it just a ballpark on the revenue? Or?
I think it's in the paper. I just can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, it was significantly higher than the Cocoa Nits, obviously.
Wow. So
we took kind of these two case studies and wanted to kind of compare and contrast the two of them and said, what could you do? Assuming that the Cocoa Nits was mostly proprietary and the Castle Chat obviously was mostly open source. Compare and contrast the two savings and see what you could come up with. So we did 3 different scenarios. The first scenario was just say, take the $976 a month in savings, the difference between the $1,020 a month versus the $44 a month, and just save that, and you saved $11,712 a year. It's not too bad, right? Who would complain about saving $12,000 a year? Scenario 2 was to take part of that $976 a month in savings and put that into search engine optimization. And we went and got some numbers from Google and some of the other AdWord marketing type things and search engine out there. And we found that on average, if you took that $500 worth of savings and put it into search engine optimization, and then just took the other $476 that was left over and just put that into savings, that would add up to $16,000 a year. So that's a little bit better. And then we said, well, what if you took the $500 a month, put it into search engine optimization, took the other $476 and put that into AdWords? And Google did an interesting study last year where they came up with the number of 8. That for every dollar you put into AdWords, that's going to increase your revenue by $8. So taking Google's numbers there, if you take the $500, put it into search engine optimization, take the leftover $476 of savings and put that into AdWords, then your savings now becomes $49,896 per year. So $50,000 a year. That's something significant. So we use that as kind of one way of looking at what's the economic impact, what's the savings you get by using open source. Obviously, that was a little wishy-washy and just based on a couple of case studies. So what we did is we looked for other proxies that we could use, other ways to go out and look and say, how can we measure what's the cost difference between a proprietary solution and an open source solution? And we ran through about 5 different models. The model that the O'Reilly folks and the mathematicians that they were working with were most comfortable with is they used the Amazon EC2 Compute Cloud as kind of a proxy, because you can go out and you can rent servers from Amazon and you can get a proprietary stack or you can get an open source stack, and there's obviously a cost difference between those two. And that was a very conservative proxy for what's the kind of the long-term cost difference between running a proprietary stack and running an open source stack. And they found that they were very, very comfortable with saying there's a 2-to-1 cost differential between using a proprietary stack and an open source stack. So open source stack is obviously more economical there. And then we took that data, crunched it through, based on the information that we got back from the surveys, talking about what are your revenues, how are you using your business, are you using it for e-commerce, these sorts of things. And we found that just the Bluehost customers alone are saving $12.4 billion a year because of open source. And that's a very, very conservative estimate.
Conservative?
Wow. Yeah, billion with a B. Real money. Okay? Now take that and expand that out just to web hosting, the web hosting market in general. We at Bluehost are probably, before the HostGator acquisition, probably 10 to 12% of the web hosting market. So take those numbers, expand them out just to web hosting in general, and you're probably talking hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. Take that to all the other places where open source gets used, and you're easily talking trillions of dollars in savings, trillions of dollars that help the U.S. economic output because we're using open source. Kind of fun stuff, right? So a couple of things to kind of finish up here, and then we'll open it up for some questions, some discussion. So it's all been interesting data, but how do we make that work? It's fine. We could talk about architecture and how to build something, but unless we're willing to grab a shovel and start digging, are we going to get anything accomplished? I want to talk a little bit about what my team does at Bluehost. I run a team called the BOSS program. BOSS stands for Bluehost Open Source Services. What we do is give back to open source communities, help make communities like WordPress and MySQL and Linux stronger. We do that through a number of interesting ways. Obviously, we have some money at our disposal that we can throw at open source communities. Say, hey, you need some money to help sponsor an event like a WordCamp or things like that. We do videos. We have an in-house video production team, so we've actually done a series of WordPress training videos to help people get up and running on WordPress, and we do that for other open source communities as well. We sponsor events. We have an affiliate program, so if an open source community wants to help people get signed up with Bluehost for their hosting, we'll actually donate the first year's all the first year's money that comes in back to that open source community to help sponsor that community. So that gives open source communities a little bit of a revenue stream that they can use for events and getting programmers together and those sorts of things. We also have developers in-house that work on open source applications. For example, where's Brian? Stand up, Brian. Mike, stand up, Mike. Brian and Mike are on my boss team. These guys both work full time on the core of WordPress, trying to make WordPress better, which is pretty awesome. I don't have to tell them, hey, go work on stuff for Bluehost. I say, go take care of the WordPress community, work on whatever the WordPress needs worked on. Brian's doing a bunch with unit tests and automated testing, and if you come to his talk this afternoon, he'll probably talk a little bit about that.
3:30, another room.
3:30 in the other room. He's also working on some of the tickets, getting ready for WordPress 3.5. Mike just started, 3 weeks ago, something like that. He's diving into the ticket system in WordPress, testing patches, trying to get through the backlog of reported bugs and try to get things in good shape for 3.5 as well. Thanks, guys. So this is another way that we give back to the open source community, and we're proud to do that. If you're part of an open source community, you'd like us to help you out, come talk to me afterward. I've got business cards up here. I'll share my contact information with you. We love to give back to open source because it's made us successful as a company. And so that's what we do. If you're interested in this research paper and you want to read the whole thing, I think it's all 35 or 40 pages long. If you get your cell phone out and QR code scanner, you could probably scan it right off the screen there. Otherwise, you can go to bluehost.com/open source, and there's a link to the paper there. It's also linked to from the O'Reilly website under the radar reports, they call them. I've also got some dead tree copies if anybody likes reading a paper copy. As an O'Reilly author, there's just something about reading something on paper I really enjoy, but it kills trees. So I'll give you your choice, one way or the other. I've got a stack of these here. If you want to come pick one up after the talk, please take them so I don't have to take them back on a plane with me to Virginia. Appreciate that. Let's open it up for some questions. Question in the background.
I'm just curious on the Bluehost thing. You mentioned HostGator. Are you guys going to integrate those two companies onto one platform, or?
So from the platform standpoint, yes, we're actually moving all the HostGator customers over to the Bluehost data center to upgraded servers and network switches and upgraded infrastructure. From a branding standpoint, we'll probably leave them separate, at least in the short term. Long term, we may roll it together from a branding standpoint. Like I said, Endurance International has several different brands, and sometimes it gets a little complicated. Different brands, and they sometimes tie back to the same infrastructure. So I can't speak to that. I'm just the open source guy. I don't make the marketing decisions. So. But yeah, from an infrastructure standpoint, yes. If you're already a HostGator customer, you'll be seeing some improvements in the next several months.
Because definitely Bluehost is superior.
Yeah, we like to think so. Very cool. Other questions?
HostGator price is going to change?
Not that I know of. I can't speak to pricing. Sorry.
Well, I've seen I actually had to come back to HostMonster deal for $295 a month for a year. I'm like, okay, I wasn't going to spend the money on a hosting plan. Like, I'll spend that. So you guys will make money off me somewhere there.
Yeah, we'll catch you one way or the other. We're good at that. But yeah, we and part of it is just the economies of scale that we're able to do because we're based on open source and because it doesn't cost us anything to use Linux and MySQL and these other tools. We're able to offer some incredible deals to our customers because of the economies of scale that open source has given us. It's really fun to watch.
Have you considered the economic impact of when a company is starting and they have very limited starting capital, how that leads to a business being able to start because of open source as opposed to not even being able to start because of how expensive it would be?
We looked at that quite a bit. We weren't able to quantify that as much as we wanted to. What it really came down to was two things. One is one of the mantras that Tim O'Reilly always talks about is creating more value than you capture. And I think that's what open source allows people to do is really create value out there, more than they're capturing and monetizing. internally, and some of that is helping other people get up and running, with very low startup costs. It's very, very hard to quantify what that exact impact is. We looked at it as much as we can, looked for other studies, looked for what information we could find, but that's really hard data to nail down in more specifics. The other thing that I like to say is, again, another quote that comes out of the research study here is that we all do better when we all do better, and that's part of the great thing about the commons and the way that open source works is the more that we're all doing better, the more we can contribute back and give back to open source, and that helps other people get up and running, and then they give back, and it's this great virtuous cycle that has proved itself time and time and time again over the past 15 years or so. It's 20 years in the early starts of open source. It's been, from my standpoint, it's been fantastic. When I first got started with open source in the 90s, my wife and I were talking. She says, "Well, maybe someday you can retire, and when you retire, then you can work on open source full time." I've been very, very privileged in that I've been able to work on open source full time for the last 7 or 8 years, and I'm not the only one. Obviously, it's made a difference. Yeah, I wish I had more specifics particularly on startups and how open source helps startups. Unfortunately, that data is hard to quantify. Other questions? Do I have to put a big question mark up on the... Oh, there's a question right there.
So, within my company, my group is very open source centric. Everything we do is open source, but our larger corporation is not. They're very Windows based. And often make the argument that even though, yes, open source is cheaper from you don't have to buy anything up front, that there's hidden costs and lack of support and that kind of stuff. What did your guys' findings reflect in that? Is there really this massive hidden cost in open source that they don't talk about?
There certainly is a cost. There's a cost in time. There's a cost in energy. There's a cost in training your employees if they're not already up to speed in open source. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to, if you're going out and hiring engineers, find people who are up to speed in open source technologies. So there is a cost. Like I said, the best proxy that we found was the Amazon Compute Cloud. The differences in cost between renting a Windows server in their cloud versus renting a Linux server in their cloud, but it was still a 2-to-1 savings, and that's a very, very, very conservative estimate. I could give you anecdotal evidence. When I was living here in Utah, I worked for Omniture before they got bought by Adobe. Just anecdotal evidence, we had on the order of 6,500 servers and 6 Linux admins. Our Windows team had on the order of about 7 Windows servers and about 7 admins. and I understand that's just anecdotal. That's just anecdotal data, but that gives you an idea. There is if you're talking about total cost of ownership, there is a cost to using open source software. It's not. The software itself is free, but it's not free to go out and use and get running in a production environment. But it's obviously it's much more economical than some of the proprietary solutions out there. And again, the best proxy we could find was that 2-to-1 ratio off the Amazon EC2 pricing. Question in the front, then we'll go back to the back row.
With web design becoming easier for most people to use, what do you see the future holding as far as website design and that kind of development? How do you keep ahead of that?
Well, I think it was eye-opening, certainly to me as a longtime web developer and systems administrator and computer geek, to look that 75% of these people that we surveyed were able to get their website up and running on their own, even though that the vast majority said that they were beginners at web technologies. I don't think you would have seen that 10 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago. I think programs like WordPress are certainly making it easier for people to have a good-looking web presence without ever having to touch much HTML. Maybe tweaking a little CSS, doing a little JavaScript, adding a few plugins. But I think we're getting to the point where people can go out and build a website without ever having to touch HTML, which is both good and bad. But I think in the long run, I think it helps more people get up and running and able to be successful, even if they're not a so-called web developer. Question in the back, and then I'll come over here.
I just wanted to follow up on his question and your comment. Some of my experience goes back in the 90s when we were doing really early CRM applications before it was even called CRM. And if you're looking at it like, can I buy an app off the shelf? Even if it's $250,000 to do my customer management and customer support versus developing it in-house, that's usually the better decision if you can find an off-the-shelf, thing that's going to work for you. Too many times when you develop things in-house, it not only costs more, but the people in-house don't have the expertise to know. Like Bluehost, for example, might be very great at web hosting, but may not know, how to develop a tech support app very well. So you have these really brilliant people that don't look outside the company. I think that's the danger of doing in-house development on the
Sure.
peripheral apps.
Sure, and it's a double-edged sword. Obviously, open source gives you the flexibility to be able to customize things and write your own things, very, very easily sometimes. Much easier, much more flexibility than you get from a proprietary solution. But the double-edged sword of that is so many times you have kind of a not invented here syndrome, and people write all their own in-house apps because they think they're smarter than the rest of the world. And so I think for me, it's not just about doing it in-house. It's looking at what other open source people have done and see if you can stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from their mistakes along the way. As well as, there's certainly a place out there for proprietary solutions, especially if it's not something that you have the in-house expertise at. Certainly.
Speaking to the same thing, my opinion of it is that when people are using open source and they've got their own WordPress site up and running and stuff like that, they feel like they've saved money and they'll spend more money on plugins or themes or things like that because they feel
Because they didn't
feel
have to
like
spend
they're
on the
and they're going to be a little more in charge long term. So I think as web developers or as webmaster or whatever, the money for me anyways is in developing kind of unique niche market plugins or themes. And they're willing to spend money on that because it's a one-time spend or something like that, and they're able to manage it and maintain it themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially vertical markets out there. I mean, it's a huge untapped, just web building websites for small businesses. I mean, we're just starting to scratch the surface with getting most small businesses on the internet. And
Well, and
huge
then
potential out
look
there.
at the knitting lady. She's dropping $1,000 a month. But if that weren't open source, if she were hiring a guy to develop all that, she'd be dropping $5,000 a month.
Yeah, she'd be in the red. It wouldn't be feasible for her to go out and do that.
She would never even be in business.
She wouldn't be in business. All right. Other questions, discussion?
So to what extent, to the cost of it, to what extent did having the cost, to get it, the cost going down, expanding the market, making things possible that wouldn't have happened, or people on getting a website where they would have gotten by without it or something like that, or exactly as well.
A little bit. Again, some of those things are harder to quantify than others. We tried to extract out as much information from the survey data as we could, and looking at our the anonymous usage data from our customers. But some of that's really hard to quantify. Without asking questions. Did you start up your business and did you think about open source versus proprietary, or did you just use something because it worked well for you? And there's so many nuances in it. It's, some of that data is more hard to quantify than others. So, we do get into obviously much more detail in the paper here. One of the other things we get into in the paper is different programming languages and technologies. What are people using for web programming? PHP came out as the dominant language there. It may not be the most elegant language out there, but while everybody else is arguing about how to make the most elegant programming language, PHP is getting the job done. Something like 78% of the accounts that we surveyed were using a database. So the web is becoming much more dynamically driven, database driven rather than just static content. I thought that was very, very interesting. The number of people who are using JavaScript on their website is growing at a pretty good clip. We see those technologies growing and being more widespread. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's some of the things that we saw come out of that. Other pieces we looked at, but it was hard to quantify, so weren't able to go into a lot of detail on the research report. Other questions, comments? Going once? Oh, question right here.
Not necessarily the report, but this is more related to what you're doing. And terms of the open source and support, to what extent are things supported as people working on it?
So from the BOSS program in Bluehost, is that specifically are you talking about, or just?
Kind of the flip side, where does the support?
Oh, from the community standpoint, where do they get the support?
So for the programs themselves, in terms of,
I would say that for the majority of the open source communities that I'm familiar with, the majority of their support comes in terms of employees letting their employees spend part of their workday working on an open source application. So that's the big thing. How many people here have contributed a patch back to WordPress or submitted a bug report back to WordPress? Or, would your boss let you spend at least part of your day, contributing back to WordPress in some meaningful way? That's the biggest impact that open source communities, the biggest piece of support they get. Obviously, some open source communities have way of taking contributions or things like that from an economic standpoint to help support them, or they charge for events and those sorts of things and use that as a way to cover their economic costs. Other open source communities try to stay away from the money as much as possible and try to do things without the economics of it. Those are probably the two biggest impacts, though. But definitely just having people that are working on the code, making it better, doing translation or documentation or bug triage or those sorts of things that the community itself doesn't have to pay for. That's by far the biggest impact.
in the case of the common developers, of someone who's working, does that tend to be a company where they're a user and so that they want to give back, or a company where they're kind of, it's like a free version or something?
It's completely mixed. I would say probably about half the contributions come from people working specifically for a company, and whether that's because they're users of it or because they're trying to sell a product that's related to it. Probably split somewhere between that. The other half is probably individual contributors that contribute because they're passionate about it and they've got some spare time and they want to help out. But it tends to be about a 50-50 corporate versus individual mix. On the corporate side, probably roughly half of those are because they're using it and they want to be involved in that. And they derive some sort of economic value from using that free software. And the other half are probably because they're trying to sell an add-on product or something that tries to monetize that open source. Question in the back.
From a corporate standpoint, what do you think the best way to convince your boss that you need to spend part of your time contributing to an open source software? I mean, obviously, at a corporate level, I can be able to say, like, you're going to make money, or there's going to be an advantage, or there's going to be something to allowing me and my team to do this.
Yeah, in my experience, it's come down to two things. It's come down to managing risk, and it's coming down to adding flexibility. And it's been my experience that upper management tends to listen more when you talk about risk and when you talk about flexibility than they do when you say yeah, we're saving all this money, so we need to give something back. If you put it in terms of if I'm actively involved in this community, it's something that we're using internally in a production environment. If I'm integrated into that community, we're lowering our risks because one, we're keeping ahead of changes coming down the pike, and we don't have to re-architect our system when the new version comes out because we're on top of things. And two, if there's security updates and those sorts of things, we're plugged in. That's a very convincing argument to upper management. The other piece is simply the flexibility. When we need changes, when we need things that so that we can be more productive moving forward, we've got people in that community that can help build those in, help make sure that our stuff is going to work well with the larger stuff. Lowering that friction of integration is another really compelling point. I found those two tend to be more persuasive than anything else.
What about open source in general? Like, we write code. What would be a good reason for us to take that code that might be proprietary, but maybe not, and open source that in general?
Because the argument I use for that is no matter how many smart people you hire and have working on that software, there's always a whole lot smarter people on the outside. And those smart people on the outside would gladly give you their knowledge. They would gladly share their experience. They would gladly give you code if you would just open up and let them. Mac.
Another way I found to get the ball rolling with giving back to open source in a business setting is inevitably we find a bug or a missing feature that's affecting us. And that seems to be, for me, the fastest, easiest way to say, hey, we found this problem. I can fix it. Is it okay if we give it back to the community when we're done? And usually it's something so small and innocuous that they don't think twice about it. And then once you've gotten in the habit of doing that, then you can move on to something.
It really builds a culture of giving back and being part of that virtuous cycle. And I can't tell you, time and time, again, I've seen it. It starts with, hey, can we give this patch back? We found a bug fix. Can we give that back? Yeah, we can do that. Hey, we're writing this new software. It's not our secret sauce. This is not what our company's about, but we happen to be using this thing, and we added this feature. Can we give that back? And it starts small. Just like how did open source get started in your organization? Somebody brought it in, and it got installed on one server, and that became very useful, and more people started using it. You know, it starts slowly, and it grows, and it snowballs from there. All right, we're out of time. I did the photos that I used in my presentation were all Creative Commons. Again, I love open source. Isn't it great? There's a link for the attribution for all the images. Thanks for coming to my presentation. I don't want to take any more time because lunch is sponsored by Bluehost, and I want to make sure you guys get fed. So thank you very much.